Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on an extraordinary journey through the life of Joan of Arc, the teenage peasant who became France's greatest heroine and saint. This remarkable tale will softly guide you through her humble beginnings in a small village, her divine calling, her miraculous military victories, and her tragic yet inspiring martyrdom at just 19 years old, all designed to carry you gently toward restful sleep. I know many of you love these long-form documentaries for your nighttime routine, and I've noticed that our wonderful Sleepy Crown community has been a bit quiet in the comments lately. Please, 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 I truly encourage you to share your thoughts tonight. Tell me which part of Joan's incredible story moves you most, what moments give you hope, or simply let me know what time you're listening and from which corner of the world you're joining our sleepy family tonight. I cannot stress enough how much your comments mean to me and how they help other listeners discover these peaceful historical journeys. Don't just listen silently. I genuinely want to hear from each and every one of you. Drop a comment right now telling me, are you Team Joan from the very beginning? What do you think about her divine voices? Which battle scene gives you chills? Your engagement makes this community so special, and honestly, seeing your thoughts and reactions is what motivates me to create these lengthy, detailed stories for you. Right now, as you settle in, whether it's 9 p.m., 11 p.m., or those precious, late-night hours when sleep feels most elusive, please take a moment to like this video if you're enjoying it so far. But more importantly, comment. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell. And then immediately scroll down and leave me a comment about what brought you here tonight. I see some of you joining us live right now. Please, I'm begging you, don't be shy. Drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and what's brought you to Joan's story tonight. Whether you're a history enthusiast, someone seeking better sleep, or simply curious about France's warrior saint, you're exactly where you belong. Are you here for Joan's courage, her faith, the mystery of her divine voices? Or perhaps you're drawn to this extraordinary tale of a peasant girl who changed the course of history? I really, truly want to know. So please share what called you to this journey tonight. Your comments create such a wonderful sense of community here on Sleepy Crown. When you share your thoughts, you're not just helping me, you're helping fellow listeners feel connected and part of something special. So, please, as we begin this journey together, take just 10 seconds to write a comment. It means the world to me. So cozy up under your softest blanket, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from 15th century France carry you through Joan's remarkable journey from Domrémy to sainthood, toward the most peaceful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to our growing Sleepy Crown family. You've chosen the perfect story to begin your journey with us, and I hope you'll introduce yourself in the comments below. Joan, later known as Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orléans, was born into a world where madness ruled a kingdom, where brother fought brother, and where the very crown of France hung in the balance between warring factions and foreign invaders. To understand her extraordinary story, we must first journey back to a time when France itself seemed cursed by God, when the line between divine intervention and human desperation had grown perilously thin. The year was 1392, and King Charles VI of France rode at the head of his army through the sweltering summer heat. For half an hour, a ragged leper had been following the royal procession, his voice cutting through the humid air like a blade. "Turn back, noble king," the leper shouted again and again. "You are betrayed." The words echoed in Charles's mind, as sweat began to bead on his brow beneath his royal crown. The king's eyes darted nervously among his courtiers. Were they watching him too closely? When he looked directly at them, they seemed to glance away. their faces unreadable beneath their ceremonial helms. The expedition had begun with such noble purpose to punish a man who had dared to attempt the assassination of the king's dearest friend. But now, in the oppressive heat, with the leper's warnings ringing in his ears, Charles felt the weight of suspicion settling upon his shoulders like a heavy cloak. A young page, drowsy from the long ride under the merciless sun, let his lance slip from his grasp. The weapon struck the ground with a resounding clang that seemed to shatter the humid stillness like thunder. In that instant, something snapped within the mind of the most Christian king of France. "Traitors!" Charles screamed, his voice cracking with sudden fury as he drew his sword. The blade caught the sunlight as he spurred his horse forward, hacking wildly at his own retinue. The courtiers, stunned and unwilling to draw steel against their anointed sovereign, could only wrestle him from his saddle as he continued his frenzied assault. By the time they managed to pin the king to the dusty ground, 5 men lay dead around them, their blood soaking into the French earth. Charles stopped struggling as suddenly as he had begun. His eyes rolled back, showing only white, and he fell into a deep coma. The courtiers exchanged horrified glances over their unconscious king. They had witnessed the moment when madness claimed the crown of France, and with it, the kingdom itself would soon follow into darkness. This was not to be an isolated incident. King Charles, once known as Charles the Beloved for his charm and wisdom, would from this day forward be remembered as Charles the Mad. The fits would come and go like terrible storms, sometimes leaving him lucid and capable of rule, but more often plunging him into a world of delusion and terror. During his darkest episodes, Charles would fail to recognize his own wife and children, insisting instead that he was Saint George, the Dragon Slayer. At other times, he would refuse to allow anyone to touch him, convinced that his body was made of glass and would shatter at the slightest contact. He wore thick clothing with iron bands sewn into the fabric, a makeshift armor against an imaginary fragility. When the madness was strongest, he would run wild through the corridors of his palaces, and court officials were forced to brick up doorways and passages to keep their king from fleeing into the dangerous world beyond. With Charles incapacitated and often confined to his chambers, the actual governance of France fell to a council of regents, overseen by Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. For a brief time, this arrangement brought an unexpected peace to the war-weary kingdom. There was a truce in the seemingly endless conflict with England that had been raging for generations, and for the first time in living memory, the people of France could think about taxes and trade rather than armies and sieges. But peace, like sanity, proved to be a fragile thing. As the older generation of council members died, their seats passed to their children, and with youth came ambition, rivalry, and the settling of old scores. The council began to fracture along lines that would define the next chapter of France's tortured history. 2 great factions emerged from this political turmoil, each led by men of royal blood who believed they alone possessed the wisdom and authority to guide France through its troubles. On one side stood the Armagnacs, led by Louis, Duke of Orléans, the king's younger brother. Louis was everything a medieval nobleman was expected to be: powerful, wealthy, charismatic, and possessed of an appetite for life that was legendary even among the French nobility. His pursuit of women was as voracious as his hunger for power, and whispered rumors followed him through the corridors of the royal court. His relationship with Queen Isabeau was particularly close, perhaps suspiciously so. Courtiers whispered behind their hands that the Queen's 3rd son, the future Dauphin Charles, bore more resemblance to Louis than to the Mad King. Whether or not these rumors held any truth, they added another layer of scandal and uncertainty to an already fractured royal house. Economically, Louis and his Armagnac faction represented the old France agricultural, traditional, rooted in the ancient feudal relationships that had governed the land for centuries. They sought to preserve the established order, even as that order crumbled around them. Opposing them were the Burgundians, led by John, Duke of Burgundy, known to history as John the Fearless. John was the king's cousin, but in temperament and vision, he might as well have come from another world entirely. The Burgundian territories in northeastern France had been heavily influenced by decades of English invasion and occupation. They had developed strong ties to England through trade, particularly in textiles and wool, and John envisioned a France that might follow the English model urbanized mercantile, with powerful cities and an economy based as much on commerce as on agriculture. The personal animosity between these two men ran deeper than political disagreement. Rumor had it that Louis had once attempted to seduce John's wife, adding personal humiliation to their public rivalry. Whether this was true or merely another of the court's endless supply of malicious gossip, it poisoned whatever hope there might have been for compromise between the factions. As the years passed, the struggle between Armagnacs and Burgundians grew more intense and more bitter. Louis, leveraging his intimate relationship with Queen Isabeau, began systematically excluding Burgundian influence from the royal council. He purchased lands in John's sphere of influence, diverting royal gifts and privileges to himself and his supporters. Soon, Louis's annual income dwarfed that of his rival by a factor of 5 to 1. John the Fearless responded by embracing populist politics, appealing directly to the common people and the merchant classes. He promised to abolish the crushing taxes that, he claimed, served only to fund the extravagant lifestyle of the court. He painted himself as a reformer and Louis as a corrupt parasite, feeding off the suffering of ordinary French men and women. The rhetoric grew more heated, the stakes higher. Both sides began kidnapping members of the royal family, including the Dauphin himself, using them as pawns in their deadly game of political chess. Finally, as the autumn of 1407 drew to a close, both factions openly threatened violence, recognizing that the kingdom stood on the brink of civil war. Moderate voices at court prevailed upon both sides to seek reconciliation. On November 20th, 1407, in a solemn ceremony at the royal court, Louis of Orleans and John the Fearless publicly reconciled, swearing sacred oaths of friendship and loyalty. They embraced before the assembled nobility, promising to work together for the good of France and the glory of their mad king. But even as these oaths were being sworn, in a rented house not far from the royal palace, a group of masked assassins sharpened their weapons and rehearsed their plans. They had been hired by John the Fearless himself, and their target was his newfound friend and ally. 3 days after the reconciliation ceremony, as a gentle November rain fell on the streets of Paris, a shoemaker's wife named Jacquette looked out her window just as Louis of Orleans emerged from Queen Isabeau's residence. The Duke was in high spirits, humming a popular song as he mounted his horse. Jacquette turned away from the window to tend to her evening chores, but the sudden sound of shouting drew her back. What she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. Louis had been dragged from his saddle and forced to his knees in the muddy street. Surrounding him were perhaps 20 men in dark cloaks, their faces hidden behind masks, their hands filled with swords, axes, and clubs. They fell upon the Duke like wolves upon a wounded deer, striking him again and again with mechanical precision. They beat him, as one witness would later testify, like a mattress, until his body was barely recognizable as human. The attack was so savage, so thorough, that Louis's servants later had to scoop fragments of his flesh into his coffin. His severed hand, raised in a futile attempt to defend himself against the blows, became a grisly symbol that would be remembered for generations, reminder of Burgundian brutality and the depths to which French nobility would sink in there. quest for power, John the Fearless made no attempt to deny his responsibility for the murder. In fact, he embraced it, commissioning scholars to write treatises justifying the assassination. Louis, they argued, had been a tyrant and a traitor, a man who defiled the queen and plotted through necromancy to murder the king himself. The assassination was not a crime, but a patriotic act, the removal of a cancer from the body politic of France. King Charles, whether through genuine madness or political calculation, pardoned John for the murder and called for a truce between the factions. But the damage was done. The blood of royal kin had been spilled in the streets of Paris, and that blood cried out for vengeance. Within a year, France was convulsed by civil war. For the next decade, the conflict between Armagnacs and Burgundians would tear the kingdom apart with a viciousness that shocked even a war-hardened age. This was not the relatively civilized warfare between kingdoms, bound by codes of chivalry and customs of ransom. This was fratricidal fury, French against French, and it reached levels of cruelty that seemed to belong more to the apocalypse than to earthly politics. Armies of both factions scoured the countryside like locusts, sacking villages, burning crops, and looting everything of value they could find. They stripped the clothes from the backs of murdered peasants, stole the grain from barns, and slaughtered livestock for sport as much as sustenance. The ordinary people of France, caught between the grinding millstones of civil war, suffered. Beyond measure, Paris itself changed hands multiple times, each occupation bringing fresh atrocities. Queen Isabeau found herself forced to leap from faction to faction, like a woman crossing a raging river on slippery stones, always seeking to protect what remained of her children's inheritance. The Dauphins of France seemed cursed, dying one after another of disease, leaving ever younger heirs to a crown that seemed more burden than blessing. It was into this chaos that King Henry V of England cast his calculating gaze. For decades, the English had been distracted by their own internal troubles, but now Henry saw an opportunity that might not come again in his lifetime. France was divided, weakened, bleeding from self-inflicted wounds. The time had come to resurrect the English claim to the French throne, to finish what Edward III had begun nearly a century earlier, in 1415. Henry launched his invasion of France, landing at Harfleur with an army of perhaps 10,000 men. His campaign began promisingly enough, but the siege of Harfleur proved longer and costlier than expected. Disease ravaged the English ranks, and by the time the city fell, Henry found himself deep in hostile territory with a much reduced force and winter approaching rapidly. The sensible course would have been to return to England with the prize of Harfleur and plan a larger campaign for the following year. But Henry was young, proud, and acutely aware that his legitimacy as king rested partly on military success. Against the advice of his more cautious commanders, he decided to march north to the English-held port of Calais, demonstrating English power and his own courage in the heart of France. The march became a nightmare. French forces harassed the English constantly, burning bridges and forcing them to take longer, more dangerous routes. Supplies ran low, and the autumn rains turned the roads into rivers of mud. By the time the English army reached the little village of Agincourt, they were exhausted, demoralized, and riddled with disease. It was there that they encountered the flower of French nobility and Armagnac force that outnumbered them by perhaps 3-1. The French were confident, well-equipped, and fighting on their own soil. They had every reason to expect victory, but the ground was soft from recent rains, and the narrow field between two patches of woods negated the French advantage in numbers. When the heavily armored French knights charged, their horses became mired in the sucking mud. Many knights fell and, weighed down by their armor, drowned in the earth that should have been their triumph. The English longbowmen, positioned on higher ground, sent clouds of arrows into the struggling mass of French nobility. By evening, the flower of French chivalry lay dead in the mud of Agincourt. 3 dukes, 6 counts, and 90 other nobles perished in a single day. Many more were captured for ransom, their absence from France as crippling as their deaths would have been. For the Armagnac faction, Agincourt was more than a military defeat, it was a catastrophe that beheaded their movement. For the Burgundians, it was an opportunity. Rather than rallying to defend France against the foreign invader, John the Fearless saw a chance to settle old scores and perhaps gain a powerful ally in his struggle against his Armagnac enemies as the English continued their advance through a divided France. The Burgundians often stood aside, sometimes even offering covert assistance to the invaders. Soon there were, in effect, 2 Frances, one centered in Paris and controlled by an alliance between the English and Burgundians, the other clinging to the Loire Valley and the south under the nominal rule of the Dauphin Charles. The royal family itself was torn apart by these divisions. Queen Isabeau, originally an Armagnac supporter, defected to the Burgundians after her former allies imprisoned her. But her son Charles, now the Dauphin, despite persistent rumors about his legitimacy, remained tied to the Armagnac cause through marriage. His mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, was one of the most powerful figures in the Armagnac faction when Isabeau ceded her powers as regent to John the Fearless, and the 2 of them combined their forces to drive the Armagnacs from Paris. They were also driving out her own son and heir. Charles was forced to flee amid scenes of massacre and slaughter that would scar his memory for the rest of his life. By 1419, it was clear that this fratricidal conflict could not continue indefinitely. France was bleeding to death, and both sides were exhausted by a decade of warfare. The Dauphin Charles, perhaps recognizing that he needed Burgundian support to have any hope of ruling a united France, invited John the Fearless to peace negotiations. The initial talks, held in July of 1419, went surprisingly well. Both sides seemed genuinely committed to ending the civil war that was tearing France apart. They agreed to meet again in September on a bridge over the Yonne River, where they would hammer out the final details of their peace agreement. The meeting was carefully orchestrated, with representatives from both factions and strict protocols governing the encounter. John the Fearless knelt before the Dauphin in a gesture of submission and respect. For a moment, it seemed as though France might finally heal its self-inflicted wounds. Then something went wrong. Perhaps John made some gesture that was misinterpreted, or perhaps one of the Dauphin's Armagnac attendants simply saw an opportunity too good to pass up. Whatever the trigger, the result was swift and brutal. An Armagnac partisan buried an axe in John's face, and the other attendants fell upon the Duke of Burgundy with their weapons. They beat him as his own assassins had beaten Louis of Orléans 12 years earlier like a matricide. They cut off his hand as a grisly echo of that earlier murder. When it was over, John the Fearless lay dead on the bridge that was meant to symbolize peace and reconciliation. The Dauphin Charles claimed that the murder was not planned, that it was the result of a tragic misunderstanding or the unauthorized action of overzealous followers. But few believed him. He had the motive revenge for Louis of Orléans. He had the means-armed supporters who had accompanied him to the meeting, and he had the opportunity carefully planned encounter in a location of his choosing. Most of France, including his own parents, believed that their heir to the throne had lured a duke to peace negotiations and murdered him in cold blood. The new Duke of Burgundy, John's son Philip, known as Philip the Good, immediately aligned himself with the English. More devastating still, King Charles VI and Queen Isabeau formally disinherited their son and declared that the English king Henry V and his descendants would inherit the French crown under the Treaty of Troyes. Signed in 1420, Henry V married Catherine of Valois, Charles VI's daughter, and was recognized as regent of France and heir to the French throne. The Dauphin Charles was branded a murderer and stripped of his inheritance. France had officially surrendered its independence to a foreign occupier. But even in this darkest hour, fate had one more twist in store. Both Henry V and Charles VI died within 2 months of each other in 1422, leaving the French crown in the hands of Henry's infant son, Henry VI. The baby king could not be crowned for years, and his regents faced the daunting task of ruling a foreign kingdom through a regency. Meanwhile, in the Loire Valley, the disinherited Dauphin continued to claim his birthright, supported by a dwindling band of loyal followers. France was more divided than ever, 3 claimants to the throne, with the country split between English-occupied territory in the north, Burgundian domains in the east, and the Rump Armagnac kingdom clinging to the south and west. It was into this broken world that a peasant girl named Gihon was born in the village of Domrémy, on the disputed border between the France of the Anglo-Burgundians and the France of the Armagnacs. She would grow up hearing stories of the Mad King, the civil wars, the foreign invasion, and the endless suffering that had become the daily reality of French life. But she would also grow up believing in something that most of her countrymen had forgotten: the possibility of miracles, the power of divine intervention, and the hope that God had not abandoned France in its darkest hour. This faith, nurtured in a small village church and strengthened by visions that would change the course of history, would drive her to attempt what no rational person would have considered possible: the salvation of a kingdom that seemed beyond all earthly redemption. The world that shaped Joan of Arc was a world of madness, betrayal, and despair. But it was also a world desperate for salvation, ready to believe in any hope, no matter how unlikely its source. When the voices of saints began speaking to a teenage peasant girl, they would find a France primed for miracles, hungry for redemption, and willing to follow even the most unlikely of saviors. In the village of Domrémy, where the future Joan of Arc drew her first breath around the year 1412, the great struggles of kingdoms must have seemed as distant as the movements of stars. This was a place where life followed the ancient rhythms of planting and harvest, where the changing seasons mattered more than the changing fortunes of dukes and princes, and where a family's wealth was measured not in gold but in the number of sheep they could graze and the acres of wheat they could sow. The village lay nestled in the Meuse Valley, in a region that belonged officially to the Duchy of Bar, but felt itself to be, in spirit if not in law, part of France. It was a borderland, a place where allegiances were complex and sometimes contradictory, where neighbors might support different factions while still sharing tools and helping with each other's harvests. The people of Domrémy were loyal to the Armagnac cause and considered the Dauphin Charles their rightful king, but they lived surrounded by Burgundian territory, a fact that would bring them both danger and opportunity in the years to come. Joan's father, Jacques d'Arc, was what medieval society called a lebaron, quite a peasant but not quite a landowner either. He worked about 50 acres of land, some his own and some rented from local nobles, and he had achieved a position of modest respect and responsibility in the village. Jacques served as the local tax collector and headed the village watch positions. That spoke to his literacy, his honesty, and his neighbors' trust in his judgment. These were not insignificant responsibilities in a world where most people could neither read nor write, and they lifted the Dark family slightly above the subsistence level that was the lot of most rural folk. Joan's mother, Isabelle Romy, was a woman of deep and simple piety, whose surname suggested that she or her family had made a pilgrimage to Rome or another holy site. In an age when such journeys required considerable sacrifice and determination, This heritage spoke to a family tradition of religious devotion that would profoundly shape their daughter's spiritual development. Isabel taught Joan the prayers that every Christian child learned, the Paternoster, the Ave Maria, and the Credo, but she also instilled in her a sense that God was not a distant figure but an immediate presence, someone who could be approached with confidence and trust. The Dark household was a busy one, with 5 children in total. Joan had 3 brothers, Jacquemin, Pierre, and Jean, and a sister whose name has been lost to history. In the close quarters of a medieval peasant home, privacy was unknown and family bonds were necessarily strong. Joan grew up learning the skills that every rural girl was expected to master: spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth, tending chickens and pigs, helping with the kitchen garden, and assisting her mother with the countless daily tasks that kept a household functioning. But even as a child, Joan was recognized as different from her siblings and playmates. She was more devout, more intense in her religious observances, more likely to be found kneeling in the village church when other children were playing games or working in the fields. Her contemporaries would later remember that she went to confession more frequently than was considered normal, sometimes weekly rather than the customary yearly visit, and that she seemed to take the teachings of the church with an unusual seriousness. This devotion was not always appreciated by her peers. The other children of Domrémy sometimes teased Joan for her piety, calling her overly serious or mocking her for the amount of time she spent in prayer. But their teasing was generally good-natured, the kind of gentle ribbing that communities visit upon members who are a little too earnest or enthusiastic about anything, whether religion or any other pursuit. The church that drew Joan so strongly was a simple stone building dedicated to Saint Remy, the bishop who had baptized the Frankish king Clovis and thereby begun the long association between the French monarchy and Christianity. It was here that Joan would have heard the stories that shaped her understanding of the world, tales of saints who endured persecution for their faith, of kings who ruled by divine right, and of the special relationship between God and the kingdom of France. But the peaceful rhythms of village life were increasingly disrupted by the larger conflicts that raged across France. Domrémy's location on the border between the Armagnac and Burgundian spheres made it particularly vulnerable to the raids and counter-raids that characterized the Civil War. The village had declared its loyalty to the Dauphin Charles, but it was surrounded by territories that supported the Burgundian cause, a situation that created both opportunity and danger. Throughout Joan's childhood, the people of Domrémy lived with the constant threat of attack. They developed elaborate warning systems, posted watches, and planned escape routes to the nearby fortified town of Neufchâteau when raiders appeared on the horizon. Several times during Joan's youth, the entire village was forced to abandon their homes and flee with whatever possessions they could carry, driving their livestock before them and praying that their houses would still be standing when they returned. One such raid, which occurred when Joan was around 13 years old, seems to have been particularly traumatic. Burgundian forces not only threatened the village, but actually entered it, setting fire to buildings and stealing cattle. The Dark family's own farm was apparently targeted, and they lost livestock and crops to the raiders. For a family living close to the margins of subsistence, such losses could mean the difference between comfort and hunger, between prosperity and poverty. It was after this raid, according to Joan's later testimony, that she first heard the voices that would change her life and the history of France. The timing was probably not coincidental. The sight of her neighbors suffering, the burning of her village, and the apparent inability of earthly authorities to protect innocent people would have raised fundamental questions in the mind of a devout 13-year-old girl. Why did God permit such suffering? Where was divine justice when the innocent were persecuted and the wicked seemed to prosper? The first voice that spoke to Joan identified itself as Saint Michael the Archangel, the warrior of heaven who had cast Satan from paradise and who was venerated as the special protector of France. According to Joan's later testimony, this first vision occurred in her father's garden on a summer afternoon. She was alone, perhaps taking a moment's rest from her daily chores, when she became aware of a bright light to her right, toward the village church. Within this light, she saw a figure that she immediately recognized as Saint Michael, surrounded by other angelic beings. The saint spoke to her in French, telling her to be a good girl, to go regularly to church, and to live a life of piety and virtue. The vision was brief, but its impact on Joan was overwhelming. When it ended, she wept, not from fear but from a sense of loss, wishing that the saints would take her with them to their heavenly realm. This first vision established a pattern that would continue for the next several years. The voices came to Joan regularly, usually accompanied by brilliant light, and often when the church bells were ringing. They spoke to her in clear French, telling her to trust in God and promising that He had great plans for her future. Gradually, the messages became more specific and the cast of heavenly visitors more extensive. Saint Michael was joined by two female saints, Saint Catherine of Alexandria and Saint Margaret of Antioch. Both were virgin martyrs who had suffered persecution for their faith, and both were particularly associated with the defense of purity and the courage to stand against overwhelming odds. Saint Catherine had been a learned woman who debated with pagan philosophers and converted many through her wisdom and eloquence. Saint Margaret had been tortured and executed for refusing to marry a pagan governor who lusted after her beauty. These saints became Joan's constant companions and counselors. They appeared to her regularly, offering guidance on both spiritual and practical matters. According to Joan's testimony, they looked exactly as she imagined saints should look: beautiful, noble, wearing rich robes and crowned with jewels that caught and reflected the divine light that surrounded them. They spoke to her as friends might speak, with warmth and affection, but also with the authority of heavenly messengers. The saints' early messages focused on spiritual development. They urged Joan to maintain her virginity, to increase her devotions, and to prepare herself for some great work that God had planned for her future. They did not initially specify what this work might be, but they made it clear that Joan was being prepared for something extraordinary, something that would require all her faith, courage, and determination. Joan's response to these visions was to make a private vow of virginity, promising Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret that she would remain pure for as long as it pleased God. This was not an unusual commitment for a deeply religious medieval girl, but it would have significant practical consequences for Joan's family. In a world where daughters were expected to marry and bear children, Joan's determination to remain a virgin represented a challenge to conventional expectations and family plans. This challenge came to a head when Joan was about 16 years old. Her father, apparently concerned about his daughter's marriage prospects, and perhaps influenced by the common wisdom that early marriage was the best protection for a young woman's virtue, attempted to arrange a match for her with a young man from a neighboring village. The prospective groom even claimed that Joan had promised to marry him, a claim that she vehemently denied. The matter was serious enough to be brought before an ecclesiastical court, where Joan was required to defend herself against the charge that she had made a binding promise of marriage. This was no mere family squabble, but a legal proceeding that could have forced Joan into an unwanted marriage if the court had found against her. However, Joan's sincerity and determination convinced the judges, and the case was dismissed. She was free to remain unmarried. But the incident highlighted the growing tension between her sense of divine calling and the conventional expectations of her family and community. Meanwhile, the larger world continued to press in upon the peaceful village of Domrémy. The English and their Burgundian allies were gradually extending their control over northern France, and the lands loyal to the Dauphin Charles were shrinking with each passing year. The most critical point in this struggle was the city of Orléans, which had been under English siege since October of 1428. Orléans was strategically vital to both sides. For the English, its capture would open the road to the Loire Valley and the heartland of the Dauphin's remaining territory. For the French, its loss would probably mean the end of organized resistance to English rule. The city's defenders had held out heroically through the winter of 1428 to 1429, but their situation was becoming increasingly desperate with each passing month. As news of the siege filtered through to villages like Domrémy, it must have seemed to many that the end of French independence was at hand. The Dauphin's cause appeared hopeless, his treasury was nearly empty, and his armies had suffered defeat after defeat. Even his own legitimacy was questioned, tainted by the persistent rumors about his parentage and the condemnation of his parents. It was in this atmosphere of despair and approaching catastrophe that Joan's voices began to speak to her with new urgency and specificity. No longer content with general exhortations to virtue and piety, Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret told her that God had chosen her for a specific mission. She must go to the Dauphin, convince him of her divine calling, and lead his armies to lift the siege of Orléans. The audacity of this mission would have been apparent to anyone, but it must have seemed particularly overwhelming to a teenage peasant girl who had never been more than a few miles from her village. To reach the Dauphin, she would have to travel hundreds of miles through territory controlled by enemies who would show no mercy to a supporter of the Armagnac cause. She would have to gain access to a royal court that was suspicious of visionaries and reluctant to trust its fate to divine intervention. She would have to convince hardened military commanders that a girl who had never held a sword could somehow accomplish what they had failed to achieve. But Joan's voices left no room for doubt or hesitation. They told her that this was God's will, that she was his chosen instrument for the salvation of France, and that no earthly power could stand against divine purpose. They promised her that she would face many challenges and dangers, but that God would be with her and would grant her the strength to overcome every obstacle. For Joan, raised in a tradition of absolute faith and unquestioning obedience to divine authority, these commands were not suggestions to be considered, but orders to be obeyed. The voices had spoken with the authority of heaven itself, and earthly considerations, her youth, her gender, her humble origins, the dangers she would face were irrelevant in the face of divine will. But human nature is not easily suppressed, even in the most faithful heart. Joan later admitted that when she first received these specific commands, she protested to her voices that she was only a poor girl who knew nothing of warfare or leadership. How could she possibly accomplish what trained soldiers and experienced commanders had failed to achieve? How could a peasant gain the ear of a king? How could a girl who had never been in battle lead armies against England's finest warriors? The saints' response was both comforting and demanding. They told her that God had chosen the weak things of the world to confound the mighty, that her very unlikelihood as a military leader was part of God's plan. Her success would be so clearly miraculous that no one would be able to doubt that it came from heaven rather than human skill or courage. She was not to worry about her own abilities, but to trust completely in the power of God working through her. This message both terrified and exhilarated Joan. To be chosen by God for such a mission was the highest honor she could imagine, but it was also a burden of almost unbearable weight. She was being asked to leave everything she had ever known, to risk her life in pursuit of what seemed an impossible goal, and to take upon herself the responsibility for the salvation of an entire kingdom. Yet as the weeks passed and the voices continued to speak to her with increasing urgency, Joan's resolve hardened. The sight of refugees from the war passing through Domrémy, the news of fresh defeats and new atrocities, and the growing desperation of her countrymen all reinforced her sense that God was calling her to action. She began to see her mission, not as an impossible dream, but as a divine necessity, something that must be attempted regardless of the odds against success. The decision to leave Domrémy was perhaps the most difficult of Joan's life. She had to abandon not only her family and her village, but also the entire world that had shaped her identity. She had to transform herself from a dutiful daughter into something unprecedented in her world, a woman claiming divine authority to challenge kings and command armies. Joan knew that she could not simply announce her intentions to her parents. Jacques d'Arc was a practical man who had worked hard to achieve a modest prosperity and respectability for his family. The idea that his teenage daughter was receiving visions from saints and planning to save France would have struck him as either madness or blasphemy, probably both. Moreover, Joan was keenly aware that if she told her family of her plans, they would almost certainly prevent her from leaving, either through persuasion or by force. So Joan made her preparations in secret, confiding only in her voices and perhaps saying farewell in her heart to the places and people she loved. She would later write to her parents, explaining her actions and asking for their forgiveness. But at the time of her departure, she left without warning, slipping away from Domrémy like a ghost in the early morning mist. Her destination was the nearest stronghold that remained loyal to the Dauphin's cause. It was there that she would have to begin the seemingly impossible task of convincing the adult world to take seriously the visions and mission of a teenage peasant girl. The garrison commander at Vaucluse was Robert de Baudricourt, a practical soldier who had survived in a dangerous borderland position through a combination of military skill and political pragmatism. When Joan first appeared before Baudricourt in May of 1428, her reception was everything she might have expected and feared. Here was a girl of perhaps 16, dressed in the red wool dress of a peasant, claiming that God had sent her to save France, and demanding an armed escort to the Dauphin's court. Baudricourt's response was swift and decisive. He told his men to take her home to her father, suggesting that a good beating might cure her of her delusions. But Joan was not so easily discouraged. She had been warned by her voices that she would face rejection and mockery, and she had been told to persist regardless of how her message was initially received. She returned to Domrémy as ordered, but only temporarily. By January of 1429, she was back in Vaucluse, and this time she was not alone. During the months between her first visit and her return, word of Joan's claims had spread throughout the region, in a time when people were desperately hungry for hope, when conventional solutions had failed so completely. The story of a peasant girl claiming divine visions attracted attention and support from unexpected quarters. Some came to see her out of curiosity, others from a deeper need to believe that God had not abandoned France in its darkest hour. Joan found lodging with the family of Henry Leroy, a wheelwright who was apparently convinced of her sincerity, if not necessarily of her divine calling. More importantly, she attracted the attention and support of two of Baudricourt's own soldiers, Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poligny. These were experienced warriors who had spent years fighting in the seemingly hopeless cause of the Dauphin, and they were, perhaps, more ready than most to consider unconventional solutions to France's problems. Jean de Metz later recalled his first conversation with Joan. He asked her what she was doing in Vaucluse, so far from her home village. Joan's response was direct and startling. "I have come to speak to Robert de Baudricourt, so that he will conduct me or have me conducted to the king. But he cares nothing for me or my words." Nevertheless, Before Mid-Lent, I must be before the king, even if I have to wear out my legs up to the knees. For no one in the world, neither kings, nor dukes, nor the daughter of the King of Scotland, can recover the kingdom of France, and there is no help for it except from me." When Metz asked whether she spoke on her own authority or on behalf of someone else, Joan replied, "My lord has commanded me to go." When he inquired who this lord might be, she answered simply, "The King of Heaven." This conversation, apparently, convinced Metz and Coligny that Joan was at least sincere in her beliefs, even if they remained uncertain about their divine origin. More practically, both men had observed that conventional military approaches to France's problems had failed consistently for years. If there was even a small chance that this peasant girl might represent some new factor in the struggle, it might be worth the risk to find out. Their support gave Joan new credibility with Baudricourt and with the people of Vaucouleurs. She began to attract crowds when she appeared in public, and her reputation for piety and sincerity grew. People brought her their problems and asked for her prayers, and some claimed that she had an almost supernatural ability to judge character and predict future events. One incident that apparently impressed many observers occurred when a local cleric attempted to test Joan's ability to discern spirits. Approaching her in clerical robes, he began to perform an exorcism, apparently suspecting that her visions might be demonic in origin. Joan's response was immediate and angry. She scolded him for approaching her in this manner, when he was not in a state of grace, suggesting that she could see through external appearances to spiritual realities. But perhaps the most important factor in winning support for Joan's mission was the deteriorating military situation. In February of 1429, news reached Vaucouleurs of a devastating French defeat at the Battle of the Herrings, where an English supply convoy had routed a much larger French force attempting to intercept it. The defeat was not only militarily significant, but psychologically crushing, demonstrating once again that French arms seemed incapable of standing against English discipline and tactics. The Battle of the Herrings also had personal consequences for the defenders of Orleans. John Stewart of Darnley, who commanded the Scottish forces fighting alongside the French, was killed in the battle. The commander of Orleans, Jean de Dunois, known as the Bastard of Orleans, was wounded. The defeat meant that no relief for the besieged city was likely to come from conventional military sources. It was against this background of military failure and growing desperation that Joan made her final appeal to Baudricourt. According to some accounts, she demonstrated an almost supernatural knowledge of military events, describing the French defeat at the Battle of the Herrings on the very day it occurred, even though news of the battle would not reach Vaucouleurs for several days. Whether this story is literally true or represents a later embellishment of Joan's legend, it reflects the growing belief among her supporters that she possessed knowledge and insights that could not be explained by natural means. Finally agreed to grant Joan's request, though his motivations were probably more practical than spiritual. The military situation was desperate. Conventional approaches had failed repeatedly, and the cost of providing Joan with an escort to the Dauphin's court was relatively small compared to the potential benefits if her claims proved true. Even if she was deluded, her journey might at least provide some comfort to the Dauphin's supporters and demonstrate that not all of France had given up hope. The decision to provide Joan with men's clothing for her journey was both practical and symbolic. Practically, a young woman traveling through enemy territory with a small military escort would be extremely vulnerable to assault. The clothing that Metz and Coligny provided, a grey tunic, black doublet, black cap, and hose tied to the doublet with laces, would help disguise her gender and provide some protection against the dangers she would inevitably face. But the decision was also symbolically significant. By adopting male clothing, Joan was making a visible statement about her rejection of conventional female roles and her assumption of authority that medieval society reserved exclusively for men. This was a dangerous step that could be interpreted as everything from practical necessity to demonic possession, depending on the observer's perspective. The cutting of Joan's hair was equally significant. In medieval society, a woman's long hair was considered one of her most important features, a symbol of her femininity and modesty. By cutting her hair short in the style of a young man, Joan was physically transforming herself into something new and unprecedented. The people of Vaucluse who witnessed this transformation understood that they were seeing not just a change of costume, but a fundamental alteration of identity. The escort that accompanied Joan on her journey to the Dauphin's court consisted of 6 men: Jean de Metz, Bertrand de Poulengy, their servants Julian and Jean de Ronecourt, the royal messenger Collet de Vienne, and Richard the Archer. This was a small force for such a dangerous journey, but it was probably the most that Baudricourt could spare without weakening the defences of Vaucluse. The route they would have to follow took them through nearly 200 miles of territory that was largely controlled by Burgundian and English forces. Any of these enemies would have been delighted to capture supporters of the Dauphin's cause, and a young woman claiming divine visions would have been an especially valuable prize. The journey would require careful planning, good intelligence about enemy movements, and more than a little luck. Joan's companions later recalled that she impressed them throughout the journey with her courage, her determination, and her unwavering faith in her mission. She seemed to have no doubt that God would protect her and guide her to her destination. When they expressed concerns about the dangers they faced, she reassured them that her voices had promised her safe passage, and that no earthly power could prevent her from reaching the Dauphin. The journey took 11 days, and the party apparently traveled largely at night to avoid detection by enemy patrols. They followed back roads and forest paths, avoiding the main highways where they might encounter larger enemy forces. Joan's male disguise seems to have been effective. There is no record of their being challenged or questioned during the journey. When they finally reached Chinon in early March of 1429, Joan's arrival created an immediate sensation at the Dauphin's court. Here was a peasant girl, dressed as a man, claiming to have been sent by God to save France and crown Charles as the rightful king. The story was so extraordinary that it demanded attention, even from courtiers who were deeply skeptical of its truth. But the court's initial reaction was far from universally positive. Many of the Dauphin's advisors saw Joan as either a dangerous madwoman or a potential fraud who might be working for the enemy. Others worried that associating the Dauphin's cause with claims of divine visions might backfire if those claims were later proven false. There was also the delicate question of Joan's male clothing, which violated both civil and ecclesiastical law and could potentially be used to discredit the Dauphin if his enemies chose to make an issue of it. The debate over how to handle Joan's arrival reflected larger tensions within the Dauphin's court. One faction, led by Georges de la Tremelle, the Dauphin's favorite counselor, was inclined toward caution and negotiation. They believed that France's best hope lay in diplomatic solutions, perhaps including some accommodation with the Burgundians that might split the enemy alliance. This faction was naturally suspicious of any development that might complicate delicate political negotiations. The opposing faction, led by the Queen of Sicily, Yolande of Aragon, the Dauphin's mother-in-law, was more willing to consider military solutions and more open to unconventional approaches. This group included several military commanders who had grown frustrated with the defensive strategy that had characterized the Dauphin's cause for years. They were more inclined to see Joan as a potential asset rather than a liability. That the Dauphin himself was caught between these competing perspectives. Charles was a cautious man by nature, inclined to deliberation rather than decisive action. He had spent years learning to distrust bold promises and dramatic gestures, having seen too many hopes raised only to be dashed by harsh realities. At the same time, he was acutely aware that his cause was in desperate straits, and that conventional approaches had failed to produce any meaningful progress. The decision was made to grant Joan an audience, but only after careful preparation and consideration. The meeting was arranged for March 9, 1429, in the great hall of the castle at Chinon. According to the most famous account of this encounter, Charles attempted to test Joan by hiding among his courtiers while placing someone else on the throne. Joan, however, walked directly through the crowd of nobles and knelt before the true Dauphin, recognizing him despite having never seen him before. This story, while dramatic and widely believed, may represent a later embellishment of what actually occurred. The more reliable evidence suggests that Joan was brought before Charles in a relatively straightforward manner, though the Dauphin may have dressed more simply than usual to see whether she would be confused by the lack of royal regalia. What is certain is that Joan made a powerful impression on Charles during their first meeting. She addressed him with confidence and authority, telling him that she had been sent by God to drive the English from France and to see him crowned as the rightful king at Reims Cathedral. She apparently displayed knowledge of matters that she should not have known, possibly including details about Charles's private prayers and doubts about his own legitimacy. The most significant moment of their first meeting came when Charles granted Joan a private audience. What was said during this private conversation has never been fully revealed, but its impact on the Dauphin was immediate and dramatic. Joan apparently provided Charles with some sign or piece of information that convinced him of the supernatural nature of her mission. Some historians speculate that she addressed his private doubts about his legitimacy as the son of Charles VI, assuring him that he was indeed the rightful heir to the throne. Whatever was said in that private meeting, it transformed Charles's attitude toward Joan. When they emerged from their private conversation, he had committed himself to giving her claims serious consideration. This did not mean immediate acceptance of her mission, but it did mean that she would be given the opportunity to prove herself through further testing and examination. The tests that followed were designed to address the various concerns that Joan's arrival had raised among the Dauphin's advisors. The first and most immediate concern was whether her visions were genuinely divine or potentially demonic in origin. Medieval theology held that supernatural visions could come from either God or Satan, and distinguishing between them was a matter of crucial importance. If Joan's visions were demonic, then following her guidance would lead to spiritual and political disaster. To resolve this question, Charles ordered that Joan be examined by a commission of theologians and church officials. This examination took place at Poitiers, where the Dauphin had established a kind of alternative university in exile, staffed by scholars who had fled from the English-occupied territories. The examination was thorough and lasted for several weeks, during which Joan was questioned extensively about her beliefs, her visions, and her proposed mission. The theologians who examined Joan faced a delicate task. They needed to determine whether her visions were consistent with orthodox Christian doctrine, whether her personal conduct demonstrated the virtue expected of someone claiming divine inspiration, and whether her proposed mission served legitimate spiritual and political goals. At the same time, they were keenly aware that their decision could have enormous consequences for the Dauphin's cause. Joan's performance during these examinations was apparently impressive. Despite her lack of formal education, she demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of theological concepts and an ability to defend her positions against learned opponents. When asked about matters of doctrine, she gave answers that were both orthodox and insightful. When challenged about the appropriateness of her male clothing, she argued that it was necessary for her protection and that God had commanded her. to dress in this manner for the sake of her mission. One exchange during these examinations became particularly famous. When asked whether she believed she was in a state of grace, Joan was faced with a classic theological trap. Church doctrine held that no one could be certain of their spiritual state, so answering yes would be presumptuous, while answering no would suggest that she was not worthy of divine visions. Joan's response was both theologically sound and rhetorically brilliant. If I am not in grace, may God put me there. If I am in grace, may God keep me there. I should be the most unhappy person in the world if I knew I was not in God's grace. The Commission's final report was cautiously positive. They concluded that Joan was a virtuous and sincere person whose visions appeared to be consistent with Orthodox Christianity. They could not definitively prove that her visions were divine, but they found no evidence of demonic influence or heretical beliefs. Most importantly, they recommended that the Dauphin should make good use of her given the desperate situation of his cause. Parallel to the theological examination, Joan underwent another test that was considered equally important in medieval society. A group of noble ladies, led by Yolande of Aragon and including the Dauphin's wife, conducted a physical examination to verify Joan's claim to virginity. This examination was considered crucial because medieval theology held that only virgins could receive genuine divine visions. The ladies confirmed that Joan was, indeed, a virgin, adding weight to her claims of divine calling. With these examinations completed successfully, Charles faced the question of what to do with Joan. The theologians had given her a clean bill of spiritual health, but this did not necessarily mean that her military claims should be taken seriously. The decision was made to provide her with a modest military assignment that would test her abilities without risking major resources or strategic positions. The mission chosen for Joan was to accompany a relief force being organized to lift the siege of Orléans. This assignment was perfect for the Dauphin's purposes. If Joan succeeded, it would provide dramatic evidence of her divine calling. If she failed, the loss would be manageable and could be explained as the result of unrealistic expectations rather than poor royal judgment. To prepare Joan for her military role, Charles provided her with a complete set of plate armor, custom-made for her small frame. The armor was white, polished to a brilliant shine, and designed to present an inspiring image on the battlefield. He also authorized the creation of a banner according to Joan's own specifications, bearing the names of Jesus and Mary, along with an image of God the Father receiving the homage of two kneeling angels. Perhaps most significantly, Joan was provided with a sword that became an important part of her legend. According to her own claims, her voices had told her that this sword would be found behind the altar of the Church of St. Catherine d'Affrine de Feboy, a shrine dedicated to one of her heavenly counselors. When messengers were sent to the church, they did indeed find an ancient sword buried in the ground behind the altar, exactly where Joan had said it would be. The discovery of this sword provided powerful evidence for Joan's supporters that her visions were genuine. For her critics, it suggested either an elaborate deception or possible demonic assistance. For Joan herself, the sword became a tangible symbol of her divine mission and a source of confidence as she prepared to enter the military world that had previously been closed to women. As Joan prepared to depart for Orléans in April of 1429, she had already achieved something remarkable. A peasant girl with no connections, no education, and no resources except her own conviction had convinced the Dauphin of France to provide her with military equipment, noble companions, and an opportunity to prove her extraordinary claims. She had passed every test that medieval society could devise for distinguishing between genuine and false visions. But the greatest test still lay ahead. At Orléans, Joan would have to demonstrate that divine inspiration could translate into military success. that faith could overcome the harsh realities of siege warfare, and that a teenage girl could indeed accomplish what seasoned commanders had failed to achieve. The siege of Orleans would be the crucible in which Joan's claims would either be validated or destroyed, and with them, perhaps the last hope of the Dauphin's cause. The army that assembled at Bowa in late April of 1429 to march to the relief of Orleans was unlike any force that had taken the field during the long years of the 100 Years' War. At its head rode not a duke or an experienced military commander, but a 17-year-old peasant girl dressed in shining white armor, carrying a banner that proclaimed the holy names of Jesus and Mary. Behind her marched not only soldiers but priests, carrying crosses and singing hymns as if they were part of a religious procession rather than a military expedition. This transformation of warfare into religious crusade was largely Joan's doing. From the moment she joined the army, she had insisted that this was not merely another military campaign, but a holy war sanctioned by heaven itself. She required the soldiers to attend Mass before battle, to confess their sins regularly, and to avoid the usual vices of military life-swearing, gambling, and consorting with the camp followers who typically accompanied medieval armies. Many veteran soldiers initially resented these requirements, but Joan's personal charisma and absolute conviction gradually won them over. Here was a leader who genuinely believed that God would grant them victory if they fought with pure hearts and righteous intentions. In an age when military campaigns were usually exercises in calculated brutality, Joan offered something entirely different: the possibility of victory through virtue. The transformation was not merely spiritual but practical as well. Joan's presence attracted volunteers from across the Loire Valley, men who had previously been reluctant to risk their lives in what seemed a hopeless cause. Merchants contributed supplies, and local nobles provided financial support. The relief expedition that had originally been planned as a modest supply mission became a substantial military force capable of challenging the English siege lines. Joan's influence extended even to the supplies being carried to Orleans. Along with the usual military provisions, ammunition, and basic foodstuffs, the convoy included more luxurious items that reflected the growing confidence of the French cause. There were barrels of wine, wheels of cheese, and even some precious spices, gifts from supporters who wanted to demonstrate their faith in Joan's mission. But perhaps the most significant cargo was intangible: hope itself. For the first time in years, French forces were advancing toward a major engagement with confidence rather than resignation. The soldiers sang as they marched, their spirits lifted by the presence of the Maid and the promise that God was finally intervening on behalf of France. The English garrison besieging Orleans watched this approaching force with a mixture of contempt and unease. They had spent months systematically tightening their grip on the city, building a network of fortified positions that controlled all the major approaches. Their commanders, veterans of successful campaigns across France, saw no reason why this latest French effort should succeed where so many others had failed. Yet there was something unsettling about reports reaching the English lines. This was not the usual French relief force, commanded by nobles whose military incompetence was legendary. Instead, it was led by a peasant girl who claimed to speak for God himself, and whose followers seemed to believe absolutely in their cause. Even seasoned English soldiers, who had grown accustomed to easy victories over French armies, found themselves wondering what this might mean. The siege of Orleans had begun the previous October, when the Earl of Salisbury had led a substantial English army south from their base in Paris. The city was strategically crucial. It controlled the bridge over the Loire River and served as the gateway to the Dauphin's remaining territories in central and southern France. If Orleans fell, the English would be able to advance, virtually unopposed, into the heart of the Dauphin's kingdom. The city's defenses were formidable, but not impregnable. Orléans was protected by strong walls and towers, and its position on the north bank of the Loire provided some natural security. But the real strength of the city lay in the determination of its defenders and the leadership of Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, who had organized a defense that had already lasted 6 months. The English siege strategy was methodical and proven. Rather than attempting a costly direct assault on the city walls, they had built a series of fortified positions around Orléans, gradually tightening their grip and preventing supplies from reaching the defenders. The most important of these positions was Les Tourelles, a massive gatehouse that controlled the southern end of the bridge into the city. By capturing Les Tourelles early in the siege, the English had effectively cut the city's lifeline to the south. Other English fortifications, known as bastilles, controlled the approaches from the east and west, while the north side of the city remained relatively open. This was not an oversight, but a calculated decision. The English commanders knew that they lacked the manpower to completely surround such a large city, and they preferred to leave an escape route open rather than risk driving the defenders to desperate resistance. The strategy was working. By April of 1429, the people of Orléans were beginning to suffer from shortages of food and military supplies. While they were not yet starving, the situation was becoming increasingly difficult, and morale was starting to decline. Some of the city's leaders were beginning to consider surrender negotiations, though Dunois and the more determined defenders continued to resist such discussions. It was into this situation that Joan's relief force approached in the last days of April. The English commanders were well aware of the approaching French army, but they were confident in their ability to deal with it. Previous French relief attempts had been easily defeated, and there was no reason to expect that this one would be any different. Regardless of who claimed to be leading it, the French approached Orléans from the south, following the most direct route from Blois. This brought them to the town of Checy, about 4 miles southeast of the city, where they encountered an unexpected problem. Joan had expected to assault the English positions immediately, driving straight through their lines to reach the city. However, the military commanders accompanying her had different ideas, led by Dunois himself, who had come out of the city to meet the relief force. The commanders explained that they could not approach Orléans directly without fighting their way through heavily fortified English positions. Instead, they proposed to ferry the supplies across the Loire at a point upstream from the city, then float them down the river to Orléans under cover of darkness. Joan was furious at this apparent display of cowardice. She had been promised by her voices that the English would not resist her approach to the city, and she was prepared to march directly through their lines if necessary. The suggestion that they should sneak around the English positions seemed to her a betrayal of the divine confidence that brought them this far. The dispute might have escalated into a serious command crisis, but it was resolved by what Joan's supporters immediately hailed as a miracle. The wind, which had been blowing from the west and preventing boats from moving upstream toward the city, suddenly shifted to the east. This allowed the French barges to navigate upstream to a point where they could safely cross the Loire, then float down toward Orléans with their precious cargo of supplies. Joan herself crossed the river with a small force of soldiers and entered Orléans on the evening of April 29th, 1429. Her arrival was triumphal. Despite the late hour, crowds of citizens lined the streets to see the maid who had come to save their city. Many reached out to touch her or her armor, hoping to share in whatever divine power she might possess. Torches and lanterns illuminated the narrow streets, creating an atmosphere more appropriate to a religious festival than a military operation. That welcome that Joan received in Orléans was everything she could have hoped for, and more. Here were people who had suffered for months under English siege, who had seen their situation grow increasingly desperate, and who were ready to believe in any source of hope. Joan's youth, her certainty, and her claim to divine calling combined to create an almost electric atmosphere of expectation and renewed confidence. But Joan's arrival also created immediate practical problems. The military commanders who had been directing the city's defense for months suddenly found themselves dealing with a 17-year-old girl who outranked them in terms of royal authority and popular support, but who had no actual military experience. Joan's demands for immediate action conflicted with their more cautious approach. Based on months of careful planning and resource management, the tension came to a head on Joan's first full day in the city. After attending Mass and touring the defenses, she demanded to know why the commanders were not preparing for an immediate assault on the English positions. When they explained that such an attack would be premature and costly, Joan accused them of cowardice and declared that God would grant victory to those who trusted in Him rather than in their own military wisdom. This disagreement reflected a fundamental difference in approach between Joan and the experienced military professionals. The commanders thought in terms of tactical advantages, casualty ratios, and strategic positioning. Joan thought in terms of divine will, righteous cause, and the power of faith to overcome material obstacles. Both approaches had their merits, but they were difficult to reconcile in practice. The resolution came when Joan decided to take matters into her own hands. On May 4th, while the military commanders were still debating strategy, she learned that some French forces were engaged in an attack on the English Bastille of Saint-Laube, east of the city. Without waiting for orders or official approval, Joan armed herself and rode out to join the battle. Her arrival at Saint-Laube transformed what had been a tentative and failing French attack into a determined assault. The sight of the Maid, carrying her banner and calling upon the name of Jesus, inspired the French soldiers to renew their efforts. Within hours, they had captured the English fortification and taken or killed most of its garrison. This first victory was crucial for establishing Joan's credibility as a military leader. She had promised divine assistance, and divine assistance appeared to have been provided. The victory also demonstrated that English positions, which had seemed impregnable for months, could actually be taken by determined assault. Most importantly, it showed that Joan was prepared to risk her own life in battle rather than simply serve as a figurehead or inspiration from a safe distance. The success at Saint-Laube was followed by a day of rest, which Joan reluctantly accepted in honor of Ascension Day. But on May 6th, she was ready to resume the offensive. This time, the target was a more complex of English fortifications on the south side of the Loire, including the crucial position of Les Tourelles that controlled the bridge into the city. The attack began with an assault on the Augustins, a fortified monastery that the English had converted into one of their strongest positions. Joan led the French forces across the river on makeshift bridges and rafts, inspiring them with her presence and her absolute confidence in victory. The fighting was fierce and bloody, but by evening the French had captured the position, with the Augustins in French hands. The English garrison at Les Tourelles was isolated and vulnerable, but this was also the strongest and most important English position, defended by several hundred experienced soldiers under the command of William Glasdale, one of the most competent English officers in France. Taking Les Tourelles would require everything the French could muster. The assault began early on the morning of May 7th, with Joan once again in the front ranks of the attacking force. She carried her banner rather than a weapon, serving as both inspiration and target for the French soldiers following her. The English defenders, recognizing the importance of their position, fought with desperate courage, as the battle raged through the morning and afternoon. Joan suffered the wound that would become one of the most famous incidents of her military career. While standing in the siege trench directing the assault, she was struck by a crossbow bolt that penetrated between her neck and shoulder, just above her armor. The wound was serious enough to knock her down and force her temporary withdrawal from the battle. For a few crucial hours, it seemed as though the French attack might stall. English defenders, seeing that the Maid had been wounded and carried from the field, began to taunt the French soldiers, claiming that their witch was dead and their cause hopeless. Some French soldiers began to waver, wondering whether Joan's wound might be a sign that God had withdrawn his favor from their cause. But Joan would not accept defeat. Despite the pain of her wound and the advice of her companions to rest, she insisted on returning to the battle. After having the arrow removed and the wound dressed, she armed herself once more and appeared before the French troops just as their resolve was beginning to weaken. The sight of Joan returning to battle, apparently recovered from what should have been a serious injury, electrified the French forces. Here was proof that divine protection surrounded the Maid, that neither English weapons nor English curses could harm someone fighting under the banner of heaven. With renewed confidence, the French resumed their assault on Les Tourelles. The final phase of the battle was decided by a combination of military skill and psychological impact. As the French pressed their attack from multiple directions, the wooden drawbridge connecting Les Tourelles to the south bank of the Loire collapsed under the weight of English soldiers attempting to retreat. William Glasdale, the English commander, fell into the river and drowned, weighed down by his armor. With their commander dead and their position compromised, the remaining English defenders abandoned Les Tourelles. The French poured into the fortress that had been the symbol of English dominance at Orléans for more than 6 months. By evening, the bridge was once again in French hands, and the siege was effectively broken. The English response to this defeat was swift and decisive. Recognizing that their position had become untenable, they burned their remaining siege equipment and withdrew from their positions around Orléans. During the night of May 7th to 8th, when the citizens of Orléans awoke on the morning of May 8th, they found that the English army that had threatened their city for more than half a year had simply vanished. The lifting of the siege of Orléans was celebrated throughout France as the first major victory over the English in living memory. For Joan's supporters, it was clear proof that her divine mission was genuine and that God had indeed chosen her as the instrument of France's salvation. For her critics, it was a remarkable military success that still might have rational explanations, but it was undeniably impressive nonetheless. Perhaps more importantly, the victory at Orléans transformed Joan from a curiosity into a genuine political and military force. She had promised divine assistance and had delivered a concrete victory that changed the strategic situation in France. She had demonstrated personal courage under fire and had inspired French forces to fight with a determination that had been lacking for years. The psychological impact of Orléans extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. For the first time since the disasters of the early 15th century, French forces had not merely won a battle but had achieved a victory so complete and dramatic that it seemed to herald a fundamental change in the war's trajectory. Towns throughout the Loire Valley that had been wavering in their loyalty to the Dauphin now declared for his cause. Volunteers flocked to join what was increasingly seen as a divinely blessed army. But perhaps the most significant consequence of Orléans was its impact on Joan herself. She had received validation that her voices were true, that her mission was genuine, and that God would indeed provide the assistance he had promised. This confirmation strengthened her resolve and emboldened her to pursue the next phase of her divine calling, the liberation of additional French territories and the coronation of the Dauphin as the rightful king of France. As Joan prepared to leave Orléans in triumph, she was no longer the uncertain peasant girl who had first approached Robert de Baudricourt with her extraordinary claims. She was now the Maid of Orléans, the saviour of France, the virgin warrior whose banner struck fear into English hearts and hope into French ones. The most famous phase of her brief but extraordinary career was about to begin. The spring of 1430 brought with it a sense of desperation that Joan had not felt since her earliest days at Vauquelin. The triumphant campaigns of the previous year seemed like distant memories as she watched the carefully constructed alliance of French cities and nobles that had supported Charles's coronation begin to crumble under renewed Burgundian pressure. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, had used the winter months to rebuild his forces and was now systematically attempting to recapture the territories that had declared for the French king during Joan's period of greatest success. Compiègne was strategically crucial to both sides. The city controlled an important crossing of the Oise River and served as a gateway between the French heartland and the territories still contested between the various factions. Its loss would not only represent a serious military setback, but would also send a powerful message to other cities about the durability of French success. If Compiègne could not be held, how many other towns would begin to reconsider their allegiances? Joan's decision to march to Compiègne's relief was made against the advice of most of the king's council and without explicit royal authorization. Charles VII, now firmly committed to his diplomatic strategy, was reluctant to authorize military operations that might disrupt ongoing negotiations with Burgundy. The king's advisors argued that Joan's time had passed, that her early successes had been the result of fortunate circumstances rather than divine intervention, and that continuing to rely on her leadership would only lead to further disasters, like the defeat at Paris. But Joan could not accept this counsel of caution and compromise. Her voices, though less frequent and less specific than they had been during her great campaigns, continued to speak to her of unfinished work and divine purpose yet to be fulfilled. They warned her that she would face capture and great trials before the summer was over, but they also promised that these sufferings would serve God's larger plan for France. The army that Joan assembled for the relief of Compiègne was smaller and less well equipped than the forces she had led during the Loire campaign. Many of her most devoted followers remained loyal, but the stream of volunteers that had swelled her ranks during the march to Reims had dwindled to a trickle. The aura of inevitable victory that had surrounded her banner had been tarnished by the failure at Paris and the subsequent months of indecisive warfare. Nevertheless, Joan's arrival at Compiègne on May 14, 1430, was greeted with jubilation by the city's defenders. Here was the Maid of Orléans, the saviour of France, come to deliver them from their enemies, just as she had delivered so many other cities and towns. The sight of her white banner and polished armour restored confidence to defenders who had been beginning to despair of relief. Joan immediately set about organizing the city's defense and planning operations against the besieging forces. The Burgundian army, commanded by John of Luxembourg, was larger and better equipped than the garrison of Compiègne, but it was also dispersed among several camps around the city's perimeter. Joan's tactical experience suggested that concentrated attacks against isolated enemy positions might succeed where a general assault against the entire siege force would fail. For several days, Joan led sorties against the Burgundian camps, achieving some limited successes, but failing to break the siege decisively. The enemy commanders, well aware of her reputation and tactical preferences, had taken precautions against the kind of sudden, aggressive assaults that had proved so effective during her earlier campaigns. They had also learned from intelligence reports about her tendency to lead from the front, making her a prime target for capture. The trap that would end Joan's military career was carefully planned and expertly executed. On May 23, 1430, Joan led what appeared to be a routine sortie against the Burgundian camp at Marny, northeast of Compiègne. The immediate tactical goal was to disrupt enemy supply lines and maintain pressure on the besieging forces. But the Burgundians had anticipated such an attack and had prepared a carefully orchestrated response. As Joan's force engaged the Burgundian troops at Marny, additional enemy units emerged from concealment to threaten the French retreat route back to Compiègne. What had begun as a limited offensive action suddenly became a desperate struggle for survival as Joan's small force found itself outnumbered and surrounded by enemy troops. Joan's response to this crisis was characteristic of her leadership style. Throughout her brief military career, rather than immediately retreating to safety, she positioned herself and her personal guard in the rear of her force, ensuring that her followers could escape while she held off the pursuing enemy. This was the same kind of selfless courage she had displayed at Orleans, Paris, and countless smaller engagements. But this time, divine protection seemed to have been withdrawn. As the rearguard action continued, Joan found herself increasingly isolated from her main force. Enemy soldiers pressed in around her, and her horse was brought down by an arrow or spear thrust. Unable to mount another horse and weighed down by her armor, Joan continued fighting on foot until she was finally overwhelmed by sheer numbers. According to the accounts of witnesses, Joan surrendered to a Burgundian archer named Lionel de Wandam, a vassal of John of Luxembourg. Her capture was a moment of triumph for the Burgundian forces, who had long sought to eliminate the most effective military leader the French had produced in decades. News of Joan's capture spread rapidly through both armies, producing jubilation among the English and Burgundians, and despair among the French. The immediate aftermath of Joan's capture revealed much about the political realities underlying the warfare of the period. Unlike an ordinary prisoner of war, who would typically be ransomed back to her own side within a few months, Joan was seen by her captors as a political prize of immense value. Her very existence represented a challenge to the legitimacy of the English claim to the French throne, and her continued presence in French hands would serve as a rallying point for continued resistance. From the Burgundian perspective, Joan's capture offered several strategic opportunities. She could be ransomed to the English, providing much-needed revenue for continued military operations. She could be put on trial for heresy or witchcraft, undermining the spiritual foundations of French resistance. Most importantly, her removal from the battlefield would deprive French forces of their most inspirational leader and most effective tactical commander. Joan's first imprisonment was at the castle of Beaulieu-les-Fontaines, where she was held under close guard while her captors negotiated the terms of her disposal. Despite the hopelessness of her situation, Joan remained defiant, repeatedly demanding to be treated according to the customs of knightly warfare and insisting that her capture was only a temporary setback in God's plan for France. Her first escape attempt, made by breaking through the wooden floor of her prison chamber, demonstrated that she had not lost her determination to continue her mission, despite the apparent hopelessness of her situation. When this attempt failed, she was transferred to the stronger fortress of Beaurevoir, where she was held under even more stringent security. At Beaurevoir, Joan was treated with a degree of respect unusual for a prisoner of war. The women of the household, particularly Joan of Luxembourg, aunt to John of Luxembourg, developed a genuine affection for their captive and attempted to persuade her to adopt women's clothing and accept a more traditional feminine role. They offered to provide her with a permanent home and position if she would abandon her military pretensions and live quietly as a woman of noble status. Joan's rejection of these offers reflected her continued belief that her mission was not complete. Her voices, she claimed, continued to speak to her during her imprisonment, promising that she would be delivered before Martinmas, November 11th, and warning her not to despair despite the trials she faced. But as the weeks passed and no rescue materialized, Joan's situation became increasingly desperate. The transfer negotiations that would determine Joan's ultimate fate were conducted between John of Luxembourg and representatives of both the English government and the University of Paris. The English were eager to acquire custody of Joan, seeing her trial and execution as essential to undermining French morale and legitimizing their continued occupation of northern France. The University of Paris, controlled by pre-English clergy, was equally eager to put Joan on trial for heresy, viewing her as a dangerous heretic whose claims threatened the authority of the established church. The final agreement, reached in November 1430, provided for Joan's transfer to English custody in exchange for a payment of 10,000 livres. Tournois, an enormous sum that reflected her perceived value as a political prisoner. The transaction was carefully structured to give legal cover to what was essentially the sale of a prisoner of war to her enemies, a practice that violated the customary laws of medieval warfare. Before her transfer to the English, Joan made her most desperate escape attempt. From a window in the tower at Beaurevoir, she could see the countryside where French forces continued to resist Burgundian advances. Her voices, she later claimed, had warned her against attempting to escape by jumping from the tower, but she chose to ignore their counsel rather than accept passive captivity while her countrymen suffered. The leap from the tower at Beaurevoir was both physically and spiritually significant for Joan. The fall, estimated at 70 feet, should have killed her outright or left her permanently disabled. Instead, she survived with serious, but not life-threatening injuries, though she remained unconscious for several days. For her supporters, this survival was proof that divine protection still surrounded her even in her darkest hour. For her enemies, it was evidence of demonic assistance or supernatural powers that made her even more dangerous. During her unconsciousness and recovery from the fall, Joan apparently experienced visions or dreams that provided her with new information about her ultimate fate. Her voices, she later testified, told her that she would be delivered from her captivity, but not until after she had endured a great trial. They warned her that she must accept whatever sufferings lay ahead with patience and faith, trusting that God's plan would ultimately be fulfilled, even if it differed from her own expectations. When Joan regained consciousness, she found herself more closely guarded than ever. Her captors had been shaken by her escape attempt and were determined to prevent any repetition. She was moved to the Burgundian stronghold of Arras, where she remained until the final arrangements for her transfer to English custody were completed. The transfer of Joan to English hands took place in late December 1430, when she was moved to the fortress of Bouverolles in Rouen, the administrative capital of English-occupied Normandy. Rouen had been chosen as the site for her trial, partly because of its strong English garrison, and partly because of the presence thereof Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, who had been selected to preside over the ecclesiastical proceedings. The selection of Cauchon as the presiding judge was not accidental. He was a learned theologian with extensive experience in church law, but he was also a partisan supporter of the English cause who had fled from his own diocese when it declared for Charles VII. Cauchon had a personal and professional interest in discrediting Joan's claims, since her success had contributed to the loss of his own temporal authority. The trial that began at Rouen on January 9, 1431, was unlike any other legal proceeding in medieval history. Officially, it was an ecclesiastical trial for heresy, conducted according to the established procedures of the Church's inquisitorial courts. In practice, It was a carefully orchestrated political drama designed to destroy the spiritual foundations of French resistance and legitimize English rule in France. The charges against Joan were numerous and complex, but they centered on three main accusations. First, she was charged with claiming to receive direct revelations from God, thereby bypassing the authority of the established church. Second, she was accused of wearing men's clothing in violation of biblical and canonical law. Third, she was charged with supporting an unjust war and promoting schism within Christendom by refusing to recognize the legitimate authority of the English king in France. These charges were carefully crafted to place Joan in an impossible position. If she maintained her claims about divine visions, she could be condemned as a heretic for asserting private revelation against church authority. If she renounced those claims, she would undermine the entire spiritual foundation of Charles VII's kingship and French resistance to English rule. Either way, her captors would achieve their fundamental objective of neutralizing her political and spiritual influence. The trial proceedings revealed Joan's remarkable intelligence and theological sophistication despite her lack of formal education. Day after day, she faced interrogation by some of the most learned clerics in France, men with decades of training in theology, canon law, and dialectical reasoning. Yet she consistently defended her positions with clarity, wit, and a profound understanding of Christian doctrine that impressed even her enemies. One of the most famous exchanges occurred when Joan was asked whether she knew she was in God's grace, a question designed to trap her between the theological sin of presumption and the admission of spiritual unworthiness. Her response, "If I am not in grace, may God put me there. If I am in grace, may God keep me there," was so theologically sound and rhetorically brilliant that it left her interrogators momentarily speechless. Similarly, when challenged about the propriety of her male clothing, Joan provided practical and theological justifications that were difficult to refute. She explained that such clothing was necessary for her protection among male soldiers, and that God himself had commanded her to dress in this manner for the sake of her mission. When offered women's clothing in exchange for permission to attend Mass, she agreed on the condition that she could return to her protective garments afterward. Throughout the trial, Joan maintained her essential claims while showing remarkable flexibility on matters of detail and interpretation. She never wavered in her assertion that her voices came from God, that her mission was divinely ordained, and that Charles VII was the rightful king of France. But she also demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of ecclesiastical authority and canonical procedure that suggested careful coaching or natural theological insight. The political dimensions of the trial were barely concealed beneath its ecclesiastical facade. English officials provided funding for the proceedings and made their expectations clear to the judges. The University of Paris, dominated by pro-English clergy, provided theological opinions supporting the prosecution's case. Most tellingly, Joan was held in an English military prison rather than in church custody, as canonical law required for accused heretics. These irregularities were noted by several members of the tribunal, some of whom expressed private reservations about the proceedings. Jean Le Maître, the vice-inquisitor of France, initially refused to participate and had to be threatened with consequences before agreeing to validate the trial. Other clerics complained that the proceedings were being rushed and that Joan was not receiving adequate opportunity to defend herself. But the most serious irregularities involved Joan's treatment in prison. She was held in chains, guarded by English soldiers rather than by women as canon law required, and subjected to threats and intimidation that were designed to break her resolve. There were also credible reports of sexual assault attempts by her guards, incidents that Joan's male clothing was specifically intended to prevent. As the trial progressed through February and March of 1431, it became clear that the outcome was predetermined. The Theological Commission, appointed to evaluate Joan's case, delivered a negative verdict that condemned her visions as demonic and her mission as contrary to divine will. The University of Paris provided scholarly support for this condemnation, arguing that Joan's claims represented a dangerous challenge to ecclesiastical authority and orthodox Christian teaching. By April, the prosecution had distilled their case down to 12 principal charges that encompassed all their major accusations against Joan. These charges were presented to her in a formal session, where she was given the opportunity to recant her errors and submit to the authority of the Church. Her refusal to do so set the stage for the final, tragic phase of the proceedings. Joan's steadfast refusal to recant reflected both her genuine conviction and her sophisticated understanding of what was at stake. She recognized that renouncing her visions would not only betray her own sense of divine calling, but would also undermine the legitimacy of Charles VII's kingship and the entire French cause. Her martyrdom, if it came to that, would serve France better than her apostasy. The threat of torture was introduced in May as a final attempt to break Joan's resistance. She was shown the instruments that would be used and warned that continued defiance would result in their application. But Joan's response was characteristically defiant. She declared that torture might force her to say anything her captors wanted, but that she would later repudiate any confession extracted through such means. Faced with Joan's continued defiance and recognizing that torture was unlikely to produce a convincing recantation, the tribunal moved toward a final resolution. On May 24, 1431, Joan was taken to the cemetery of St. Twin, where a scaffold had been erected for the public reading of her sentence. The intention was to conduct a public execution that would serve as both punishment and warning to any who might follow her example. The scene at St. Wouin was carefully orchestrated for maximum psychological impact. Thousands of spectators gathered to witness the end of the Maid of Orléans, including English soldiers, French clergy, and ordinary citizens whose loyalties were divided. Joan was brought to the scaffold wearing a woman's dress, a symbolic renunciation of the male clothing that had been one of the principal charges against her. As the formal sentence was read, condemning Joan as a relapsed heretic and ordering her immediate execution, something unexpected happened. Whether from genuine terror at the prospect of burning alive, or from a moment of human weakness after months of imprisonment and intimidation, Joan suddenly declared her willingness to recant. She agreed to sign a document renouncing her visions and promising to submit to the authority of the Church. The abjuration that Joan signed on the scaffold at St. Win represented the lowest point of her brief career. The document she put her mark to, she could not write her name, contained a comprehensive renunciation of everything she had claimed and accomplished. She admitted that her visions were false, that her mission was self-conceived, and that she had been wrong to wear men's clothing or to support warfare against the legitimate English authorities. This recantation should have ended Joan's story with her disgrace rather than her martyrdom. According to the usual procedures of ecclesiastical courts, a heretic who recanted would be sentenced to life imprisonment rather than death. Joan was taken back to her cell wearing women's clothing and apparently resigned to spending the rest of her life in captivity. But Joan's recantation lasted only 3 days. On May 27th, guards found her once again wearing men's clothing, an act that constituted a relapse into her former errors and automatically triggered a death sentence. When questioned about this change, Joan declared that her voices had reproached her for her moment of weakness and had commanded her to resume her true mission, regardless of the consequences. The reasons for Joan's return to men's clothing remain historically disputed. Some accounts suggest that her guards deliberately provided her with male garments while removing her women's clothing, forcing her to choose between modesty and compliance with her abjuration. Others indicate that Joan herself requested the change, having decided that martyrdom was preferable to a life of imprisonment and apostasy. Whatever the immediate circumstances, Joan's decision to resume men's clothing represented a return to her fundamental convictions about her divine mission. She told her interrogators that she could not deny the reality of her visions or abandon her belief that God had chosen her to serve France. If this meant death, she was prepared to accept that fate rather than live as a traitor to her calling. The tribunal's response to Joan's relapse was swift and inevitable. On May 29, 1431, a session of judges unanimously condemned her as a relapsed heretic who had returned to her errors after abjuring them. According to both canon and civil law, such a person must be handed over to the secular authorities for execution. There would be no further opportunities for recantation or appeals for mercy. The night before her execution, Joan was visited by several clergy who made final attempts to convince her to save her life by maintaining her recantation. She refused, declaring that she would rather die than live in denial of the truth that God had revealed to her. She requested permission to receive the sacraments, a controversial request since condemned heretics were normally denied the Church's final comforts. After considerable debate, Joan was granted permission to receive communion one last time, a decision that reflected the unease some clergy felt about her condemnation. If she were truly the heretic the court had declared her to be, such sacramental grace would be inappropriate. The fact that it was granted suggested lingering doubts about the justice of her sentence. On the morning of May 30, 1431, Joan was taken from her cell at Bouvroulle to the old marketplace of Rouen, where a scaffold and stake had been prepared for her execution. She was accompanied by 2 Dominican friars who had volunteered to provide spiritual comfort during her final hours. The crowds that gathered to witness her death included not only English soldiers and officials, but also many ordinary citizens of Rouen, some sympathetic and others hostile. Joan's behavior during her final hours impressed even many of her enemies with its courage and dignity. She showed no sign of the terror or hysteria that often characterized condemned prisoners, instead maintaining the same calm confidence that had marked her throughout her trial. She asked for a cross to be held before her eyes so that she could see it while the flames consumed her, and she requested that the prayers for her soul be said loudly enough for her to hear above the noise of the fire. As the flames began to rise around her, Joan called out the name of Jesus repeatedly, affirming her faith in Christ even as her earthly life ended. According to several witnesses, she continued to call upon her Savior until the smoke and flames made speech impossible. Her final moments were marked by the same unwavering faith that had sustained her throughout her brief but extraordinary career. The execution of Joan of Arc was intended by her enemies to mark the end of French resistance and the validation of English rule in France. Instead, it marked the beginning of her transformation from a historical figure into a martyr and symbol, whose influence would prove far more powerful in death than it had been in life. The flames that consumed her body at Rouen could not destroy the inspiration she had provided to the French cause or the legitimacy she had conferred upon Charles VII's kingship in the immediate aftermath of Joan's execution. English authorities took elaborate precautions to prevent the creation of relics that might become focal points for renewed French resistance. Her ashes were carefully collected and thrown into the Seine River, ensuring that no physical remains could be venerated by her supporters. The transcripts of her trial were widely distributed to demonstrate the justice of her condemnation and to discourage any attempts to portray her as a martyr. But these efforts to erase Joan's influence proved futile. News of her execution spread rapidly throughout France and beyond. creating a wave of outrage and sympathy that strengthened rather than weakened French resistance to English rule. Many who had been skeptical of Joan's claims during her lifetime now viewed her death as proof of her sanctity and the justice of her cause. The military impact of Joan's martyrdom was almost immediate. French forces, fighting now not just for their king, but also to avenge their murdered heroine, displayed a determination and effectiveness that had been lacking since her capture. The psychological advantage that England had hoped to gain from Joan's trial and execution was quickly reversed as her death became a rallying cry for renewed resistance. More importantly, Joan's execution solved the problem of Charles VII's legitimacy in a way that military victories alone could never have accomplished. A king crowned through the intervention of a saint and martyr could not be dismissed as a usurper or pretender. The very brutality of Joan's death served to validate the spiritual foundations of his rule and to cast his English rivals as the enemies of God himself. The long-term consequences of Joan's martyrdom extended far beyond the immediate military and political situation. Her story became embedded in French national consciousness as the ultimate example of patriotic sacrifice, inspiring generations of French men and women to resist foreign domination and to believe in the possibility of miraculous deliverance. The peasant girl who had saved France became, in death, the eternal symbol of French independence and divine favor. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Joan's legacy was its demonstration that divine intervention in human affairs was not only possible but observable. In an age when the relationship between earthly and heavenly authority was constantly debated, Joan's career provided compelling evidence that God remained actively involved in human history, and that he might choose the most unlikely instruments to accomplish his purposes. The rehabilitation trial that began in 1450, 19 years after Joan's execution, officially vindicated her claims and condemned the procedures that had led to her death. This rehabilitation was partly political, designed to strengthen Charles VII's position by demonstrating that his coronation had been validated by a saint rather than a heretic. But it was also a genuine attempt to correct a judicial error and to acknowledge the extraordinary nature of Joan's mission. The rehabilitation proceedings heard testimony from more than 100 witnesses, including many who had known Joan personally during her lifetime. Their accounts, while sometimes colored by the passage of time and the knowledge of her ultimate fate, provided a detailed picture of a young woman whose combination of practical intelligence, spiritual insight, and absolute courage had enabled her to accomplish the impossible. In 1909, nearly 5 centuries after her death, Joan was beatified by the Catholic Church, the final step before sainthood in the formal process of canonization. 11 years later, in 1920, she was officially declared a saint. Her feast day set for May 30th, the anniversary of her martyrdom. These ecclesiastical honors represented the Church's formal acknowledgement that the voices Joan claimed to hear had indeed come from heaven and that her mission had been genuinely divine. Today, Joan of Arc stands as one of history's most remarkable figures, a person whose brief career demonstrates the power of absolute faith to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Her story continues to inspire people of all nations and faiths, not merely as an example of patriotic heroism, but as evidence that individuals, no matter how humble their origins, can play decisive roles in shaping the course of human events. Teenager who left her father's house in Domrémy to save France accomplished more in her 19 years than most people achieve in much longer lifetimes. She lifted sieges, won battles, crowned a king, and transformed the political landscape of medieval Europe. But her greatest achievement may have been her demonstration that the age of miracles had not ended, that God still spoke to those with ears to hear, and that even the youngest and humblest among us might be called to perform works of world-changing Significance. Joan's final legacy lies not in the specific details of her military campaigns or political achievements, but in her testament to the power of faith to overcome fear, doubt, and overwhelming odds. She faced every challenge of her brief career with the same response: absolute trust in divine guidance and willingness to risk everything in service of what she believed to be God's will. This simple but profound approach to life's difficulties continues to offer hope and inspiration to anyone who faces seemingly impossible circumstances. In the end, Joan of Arc's story is not merely about one extraordinary individual or even about the particular historical circumstances of France. It is about the eternal human capacity for courage, faith, and sacrifice in service of ideals larger than ourselves. It is about the possibility that each of us, no matter how ordinary we may seem, might be called to play a role in the great drama of human history. And so we leave Joan of Arc, where we found her not in the flames of Rouen, but in the realm of eternal memory, where her courage burns as brightly today as it did 6 centuries ago. The peasant girl who became a saint, the teenager who saved a kingdom, the martyr whose death accomplished more than her life. These aspects of her legacy continue to speak to us across the centuries, reminding us that the age of heroes has not ended and that the voice of the divine still calls to those brave enough to listen and respond. As you drift towards sleep, dear listener, let your dreams be filled with the gentle courage of Joan of Arc, with the faith that can move mountains, and the love that can save nations. In her story, we find not only the history of medieval France, but the timeless truth that goodness, truth, and divine purpose will ultimately prevail over all the forces that would oppose them. Rest peacefully in that knowledge, and may your own dreams be filled with the light that guided Joan from her father's garden in Domrémy to her eternal place among the saints of God. The bells of Reims still ring out across the French countryside, as they did on that glorious day in July 1429, when a peasant girl stood beside her king and watched the fulfillment of her impossible dream. In those bells, we hear not only the echo of medieval history, but the continuing call to courage, faith, and service that Joan's life represents. Her story ends not with death, but with transformation, not with defeat, but with victory, not with an ending, but with a beginning that continues to unfold in every heart that is touched by her extraordinary example. Sleep well, gentle listener, and may the angels that spoke to Joan in her father's garden watch over your own dreams tonight. In the peace of slumber, find the same trust in divine providence that sustained Joan through every trial, and wake tomorrow with renewed faith in the possibility of miracles in your own life. For the God who chose a peasant girl to save France is the same God who has plans and purposes for each of us, plans that may seem impossible from our limited perspective, but which are well within the power of divine love to accomplish. The story of Joan of Arc is finished, but its meaning continues forever. In her life, death, and eternal legacy, we find not only inspiration, but invitation, the call to live with the same courage, faith, and dedication to truth that made a teenage peasant girl into one of history's greatest saints. May that call find an answer in each of our hearts, and may we prove worthy of the heritage of courage that Joan bequeathed to all who would follow in her footsteps. Good night, dear listeners, and may your dreams be blessed with the same divine light that guided Joan from her humble village to her place among the stars. In her memory, we find not only the history of the past, but the hope of the future. Not only the record of what was accomplished, but the promise of what might yet be achieved by any heart brave enough to answer heaven's call. Rest in peace, and wake in hope, for the spirit of Joan of Arc lives on in every act of courage, every leap of faith, and every life dedicated to something greater than itself. The victory at Orléans had been just the beginning. Joan's voices now urged her toward an even more ambitious goal: the coronation of the Dauphin Charles as the rightful King of France at Reims Cathedral, the traditional site where French monarchs had been crowned for centuries. But between Orléans and Reims lay a network of English-held fortresses along the Loire River, each one a potential obstacle to Joan's divine mission. Joan wasted no time in pressing her advantage. On May 9th, 1429, just one day after the English withdrawal from Orléans, she departed the liberated city and rode to meet the Dauphin at Tours. Her purpose was simple but audacious: to convince Charles that God's will demanded an immediate march on Reims, regardless of the military challenges such a campaign would entail. The meeting between Joan and Charles at Tours was a crucial moment in the development of their relationship. The Dauphin had gambled on Joan's claims at Orléans, and that gamble had paid off spectacularly. But success in relieving a siege was one thing. Launching an offensive campaign deep into enemy territory was quite another. Charles was by nature a cautious man, more inclined to consolidate gains than to risk them in pursuit of greater victories. Joan, however, was adamant. Her voices had told her that the English were demoralized and vulnerable, that French forces could advance to Reims without significant opposition if they moved quickly and decisively. She argued that delay would only allow the English time to recover from their defeat and reinforce their positions. More importantly, she insisted that God's plan required the Dauphin's coronation to take place as soon as possible, while the momentum of divine favor was still strong. The debate within the Dauphin's council reflected the larger tensions that had always existed between Joan's spiritual certainty and the practical considerations of medieval warfare. Military advisors pointed out that the route to Reims passed through heavily fortified enemy territory, that the French army lacked the supplies for an extended campaign, and that failure would undo all the gains achieved at Orléans. Financial advisors noted that the royal treasury was nearly empty and that such a campaign would require resources that simply did not exist. But Joan's supporters, led by the Duke of Alençon and other young nobles who had been inspired by her success, argued for boldness over caution. They pointed out that conventional military wisdom had counseled against the relief of Orléans, yet Joan had succeeded where experienced commanders had failed. Perhaps this was another situation where faith and divine favor mattered more than material calculations. The compromise that emerged from these deliberations was characteristic of the Dauphin's approach to decision. Rather than marching directly on Reims, the French army would first clear the English from their remaining strongholds along the Loire River. This would secure the Dauphin's base territory, provide additional resources for the eventual march on Reims, and test whether Joan's success at Orléans could be repeated at other fortified positions. The Loire campaign that followed became a masterclass in the new style of warfare that Joan had introduced. Where previous French campaigns had been characterized by lengthy sieges, cautious maneuvering, and a defensive mindset, Joan's approach was aggressive, swift, and psychologically devastating to enemy morale. The first target was Jargeau, a strongly fortified town about 20 miles east of Orléans. The English garrison, commanded by the Earl of Suffolk, had spent months strengthening the town's defenses and was confident in its ability to withstand the siege. What they encountered instead was something unprecedented in their experience: a French army that attacked with religious fervor, led by a peasant girl whose banner seemed to inspire French soldiers to levels of courage and determination that defied rational explanation. The assault on Jargeau began on June 11th, 1429, with Joan personally leading the advance. She carried her banner rather than a weapon, positioning herself at the most dangerous points of the attack to inspire her followers. During the assault, she was struck on the head by a stone thrown from the walls. a blow that split her helmet and knocked her briefly unconscious. But she recovered quickly and returned to the fight, her apparent invulnerability only adding to her legend. The town fell within a day, a remarkably short time for what should have been a difficult siege. The Earl of Suffolk was captured, along with most of his garrison. More importantly for French morale, the victory demonstrated that Orléans had not been a fluke. Joan's presence really did seem to grant French forces an almost supernatural ability to overcome fortified positions that should have been impregnable. From Jourgeau, the French army moved quickly to Meung-sur-Loire, where they encountered another English garrison. This time, the psychological impact of Joan's reputation preceded her arrival. The English defenders, having heard reports of what had happened at Ajaccio, offered only token resistance before withdrawing to their strongest positions. The French were able to secure the bridge and town with minimal casualties. The pattern was repeated at Beaugency, where the English garrison evacuated their positions after only a brief siege. Word was spreading throughout the English-occupied territories that the French had found some new source of strength, that their armies were fighting with a determination and effectiveness that had been absent for decades. English commanders, who had grown accustomed to easy victories over French forces, were beginning to question their own assumptions about the war's trajectory. But the most significant engagement of the Loire campaign was yet to come. As the French army approached Patay, they encountered a substantial English force under the command of Sir John Fastolf, one of England's most experienced and capable military commanders. Fastolf had been rushing north from the Burgundian territories to relieve the besieged English garrisons along the Loire, and his army included many of the veterans who had won England's greatest victories in France. The Battle of Patay, fought on June 18, 1429, became one of the most complete French victories of the entire 100 Years' War. The English had positioned themselves defensively, using their traditional tactics of dismounted men-at-arms, protected by stakes and supported by long bowmen. These tactics had won at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, and there was no obvious reason why they should not work again. But Joan's influence had transformed French military psychology in ways that went far beyond mere tactical innovation. French soldiers who had previously approached battle with resignation and fear now fought with confidence and aggression. They no longer saw English armies as invincible, but as obstacles that divine favor would help them overcome. The battle began when French scouts discovered the English position earlier than expected. Rather than waiting for the main army to arrive and carefully preparing their attack, the French vanguard immediately charged the English lines. This was exactly the kind of impetuous behavior that had led to French defeats in the past. But this time the results were dramatically different. The English longbowmen, caught by surprise and not yet properly positioned, were overrun before they could establish an effective field of fire. The dismounted men-at-arms, deprived of their missile support and facing an enemy whose morale was higher than any English force had encountered in decades, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of the French attack. The result was a rout that reversed the pattern of previous Anglo-French battles. Instead of French knights being slaughtered by English arrows, it was English soldiers who fled in panic, while French cavalry pursued them across the countryside. Fastolf himself escaped with a small body of troops, but most of his army was destroyed. More than 2,000 English soldiers were killed or captured, while French losses were minimal. For Joan, the victory at Patay was particularly satisfying, because it avenged the defeat at Agincourt that had haunted French memories for more than a decade. The flower of English military power in France had been crushed by forces fighting under her banner, demonstrating beyond any reasonable doubt that divine favor had shifted to the French cause. But perhaps more importantly, Patay eliminated the last major English field army capable of challenging a French advance toward Reims. The road to the Coronation city was now open, and Joan's voices were urging her to take advantage of this opportunity before English resistance could reorganize. The march from the Loire valley to Reims, which began on June 29, 1429, became a triumphal procession unlike anything France had seen in living memory. Town after town opened its gates to the approaching French army, often without any resistance whatsoever. The psychological impact of Joan's victories had preceded her, convincing local commanders and populations that resistance was futile. At Orléans, the citizens simply opened their gates and declared their loyalty to the Dauphin. At St. A delegation of civic leaders rode out to meet the French army and formally surrender their town. Even at Troyes, where the Treaty of Troyes had been signed 9 years earlier to disinherit the Dauphin, the citizens ultimately chose to submit rather than resist. The surrender of Troyes was particularly significant, both practically and symbolically. This was the city where Charles's own parents had formally stripped him of his inheritance and declared the English King Henry V to be the rightful heir to the French throne. For the Dauphin to enter Troyes as a conqueror represented a personal vindication as well as a military triumph. Joan's role in securing Troyes demonstrated her growing sophistication as both a military leader and a political figure. When the city's leaders initially refused to surrender, she deployed a combination of psychological pressure and practical threats that convinced them to reconsider. She positioned her army within sight of the walls, flew her banner prominently where all could see it, and sent messages promising clemency to those who submitted and destruction to those who continued to resist. The effectiveness of these tactics reflected the broader transformation that Joan had brought to French warfare. Previous French campaigns had relied primarily on superior numbers or tactical advantages to achieve victory. Joan's approach was more subtle and more devastating. She waged war against enemy morale and confidence, convincing opponents that resistance was not merely difficult but actually contrary to divine will. The psychological dimensions of Joan's warfare were perhaps most clearly demonstrated by the response of Brother Richard, a famous preacher who had been conducting religious revivals throughout the Burgundian territories. Brother Richard was known for his apocalyptic sermons and his ability to inspire religious fervor among common people. When Joan's army approached Troyes, he came out to meet her, apparently intending to test whether her claims were genuine. The meeting between Joan and Brother Richard became one of the most famous incidents of the march to Reims. The preacher, according to witnesses, was initially skeptical of Joan's claims and suspicious that she might be an agent of Satan rather than of God. But after speaking with her at length, he became convinced not only of her sincerity but of her divine calling. Brother Richard, through his considerable influence behind Joan's cause, helping to convince the people of Troyes that submission was not merely prudent but spiritually necessary. The conversion of Brother Richard was significant because it demonstrated Joan's ability to win over religious authorities as well as military ones. Medieval warfare was not merely a matter of physical force, but of spiritual legitimacy, and Joan's success in gaining the support of respected religious figures strengthened her position immeasurably. By mid-July, the French army had reached the outskirts of Reims, the goal that had seemed impossibly distant just 2 months earlier. The city that housed the cathedral where French kings had been crowned for centuries was now within Joan's grasp, and her voices were telling her that the moment of ultimate triumph was at hand. The citizens of Reims faced a difficult decision. Their city had been under English control for nearly a decade, and many of its leading citizens had prospered under English rule. Resistance might lead to the destruction of their city and the loss of everything they had built, but submission meant accepting that the tide of war had turned decisively against England and in favor of the Dauphin. whose legitimacy they had been taught to question. The decision was made easier by the overwhelming evidence of French military success and the apparent hopelessness of continued resistance. On July 16, 1429, the gates of Reims opened to admit the Dauphin and his army. The following day, in a ceremony that fulfilled Joan's divine mission, Charles VII was crowned King of France in the cathedral where his predecessors had received their sacred anointing for more than 6 centuries. The coronation ceremony was everything that Joan had envisioned when her voices first commanded her to seek out the Dauphin. Charles knelt before the altar while the Archbishop of Reims anointed him with the holy oil of Saint Remy, the same sacred chrism that had blessed Clovis, Charlemagne, and all the great kings of French history. The crown of France was placed upon his head, and he rose, not as the uncertain Dauphin who had fled from Paris, but as the anointed king whose right to rule had been confirmed by both earthly ceremony and divine intervention. Joan stood beside the newly crowned king throughout the ceremony, holding the banner that had led French forces to victory after victory. When Charles offered to honor her by allowing her to kneel before him as his vassal, she declined, insisting that she served God rather than earthly rulers. But she did allow herself to show emotion when the ceremony was complete, reportedly weeping with joy at the fulfillment of the mission her voices had given her. The coronation at Reims represented the culmination of everything Joan had worked toward since leaving her father's house in Domrémy. She had promised to drive the English from Orléans, and she had done so. She had promised to clear the Loire valley of enemy forces, and she had accomplished that as well. Most importantly, she had promised to see the Dauphin crowned as the rightful King of France, and that promise too had been fulfilled. But even in this moment of triumph, there were signs that Joan's mission was entering a new and more difficult phase. Her voices had been specific and clear about the goals she was to achieve: lift the siege of Orléans and crown the king at Reims. Both tasks had been completed successfully. But what came next was less clear, both to Joan and to the voices that had guided her thus far. Moreover, the political situation had become considerably more complex. Charles was now the crowned King of France, but large portions of his kingdom remained under enemy control. Paris, the traditional capital, was still in English hands. The Burgundians remained allied with England, controlling wealthy and strategically important territories in the east. The war was far from over, but Joan's specific divine mandate appeared to have been fulfilled. This uncertainty about her continuing role was reflected in the debates that began almost immediately after the coronation ceremony. Some of Charles's advisors argued that the time had come to consolidate the gains that had been achieved, to negotiate from a position of strength rather than risk everything in pursuit of additional victories. Others, particularly the younger nobles who had been inspired by Joan's successes, urged continued military action to drive the English completely out of France. Joan herself was conflicted. Her voices continued to speak to her, but their messages were less specific than they had been during the campaigns leading to Reims. They assured her that God's plan for France was not yet complete, but they provided less clear guidance about what steps should be taken next. For the first time since beginning her mission, Joan found herself operating without the absolute certainty that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her early campaigns. The king, now that he had achieved the legitimacy that came with coronation, was inclined toward caution. The royal treasury remained nearly empty despite the recent victories, and maintaining a large army in the field was expensive. There were also diplomatic opportunities to be explored, particularly the possibility of negotiating with the Duke of Burgundy to break his alliance with England. These practical considerations conflicted with Joan's sense that divine momentum should not be wasted through delay and negotiation. She argued passionately for an immediate march on Paris, convinced that the psychological impact of recent victories would make the capital's capture relatively easy. Her voices, she claimed, had promised her that no city would be able to resist her banner if she pressed forward. While divine favor was still strong, the compromise that emerged from these debates was characteristically cautious. The army would advance toward Paris, but slowly and with careful attention to diplomatic possibilities. Charles would negotiate with local commanders and civic leaders, offering terms for peaceful submission before resorting to military force. This approach had worked well during the march to Reims, but it required a level of patience that Joan found increasingly difficult to maintain. The advance toward Paris, which began in late July 1429, initially proceeded much as the march to Reims had done. Towns along the route surrendered without resistance, and the French army grew larger as volunteers flocked to join what appeared to be an unstoppable force. But the closer they came to the capital, the stiffer the resistance became. Paris was not Troy or Auxerre. It was the largest city in France, heavily fortified and garrisoned by substantial English and Burgundian forces. More importantly, it was the symbolic heart of the enemy alliance, the place where English claims to the French throne had been proclaimed and where the legitimacy of Charles's rule was most strongly contested. The defenders of Paris knew that they were fighting not merely for a city, but for the entire structure of power that had been built over the previous decade. The approach to Paris also revealed growing tensions within the French command structure. Joan's authority had been unquestioned during the campaigns leading to Reims because her objectives had been clear and her divine guidance appeared infallible. But now, operating in a more politically complex environment, her absolute confidence sometimes conflicted with the more nuanced judgments of experienced commanders and advisors. These tensions came to a head when the French army reached the outskirts of Paris in early September. Joan wanted to launch an immediate assault on the city's defenses, confident that divine favor would grant victory just as it had at Orléans and the other strongholds along the Loire. But her military advisors were more cautious, pointing out that Paris was far stronger than any position they had previously attacked, and that failure would undo much of what had been achieved. The debate over strategy was complicated by simultaneous diplomatic negotiations with the Duke of Burgundy. Charles's advisors believed that there was a real possibility of convincing Burgundy to abandon his English alliance, particularly given the dramatic shift in military momentum. Such a diplomatic victory would be far more valuable than the capture of Paris, since it would immediately neutralize a large portion of enemy strength without the costs and risks of continued warfare. Joan was deeply skeptical of these diplomatic efforts. Her experiences had taught her that victory came through decisive action rather than negotiation, and she suspected that diplomatic delays would only give the enemy time to recover and reorganize. More fundamentally, she believed that God's plan for France required the complete expulsion of English forces, not a negotiated settlement that might leave them in control of significant territories. The tension between military and diplomatic approaches was never fully resolved, and this indecision may have contributed to the failure that was about to befall Joan's cause. When the assault on Paris finally began on September 8, 1429, it lacked the unity of purpose and divine confidence that had characterized Joan's earlier victories. The attack was launched against the Porte Saint-Honore, one of the strongest sections of the city's defenses. Joan personally led the assault, carrying her banner and calling upon the defenders to surrender in the name of the rightful King of France. But the response was very different from what she had encountered at other fortified positions. The defenders of Paris fought with a determination that matched her own, convinced that they were defending the legitimate government of France against a usurper supported by witchcraft. The battle raged throughout the day, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Joan was wounded in the thigh by a crossbow bolt, a serious injury that forced her withdrawal from the fighting. For the first time since beginning her military career, she was unable to inspire her followers to victory through her personal example and presence. As evening approached and French casualties mounted, it became clear that the assault was failing. Charles, who had been watching the battle from a distance, ordered a withdrawal. The army that had seemed invincible just weeks earlier retreated from Paris in defeat, carrying their wounded leader with them. The failure at Paris was more than just a military setback. It was a psychological blow that called into question fundamental assumptions about Joan's divine calling. Her supporters struggled to explain how God could have allowed his chosen instrument to suffer defeat at the very moment when complete victory seemed within reach. Her critics pointed to the failure as evidence that her earlier successes had been due to luck and circumstances rather than divine intervention. Joan herself was devastated by the defeat, not only because of the military consequences, but because it seemed to suggest that her voices had either misled her or that she had somehow failed to understand their guidance correctly. For the first time since beginning her mission, she was forced to confront the possibility that her absolute faith in divine support might be misplaced. The immediate aftermath of Paris marked a turning point in Joan's career and in her relationship with the king and his court. Charles, who had been emboldened by recent victories to pursue an aggressive military strategy, now reverted to his more cautious instincts. He negotiated a truce with the Burgundians and disbanded much of the army that had won such spectacular victories over the summer. Joan found herself increasingly marginalized within the royal court. The military commanders who had initially been skeptical of her abilities, but had been won over by her successes, now began to question whether she should continue to play a leading role in French strategy. The diplomatic faction, led by Georges de la Tremelle, gained influence by arguing that negotiation offered better prospects than continued warfare. For Joan, this political marginalization was perhaps more painful than the physical wound she had received at Paris. She had grown accustomed to being at the center of royal decision-making, to having her counsel sought and her judgment respected. To be relegated to the sidelines while others made decisions about France's future contradicted everything she believed about her divine mission. The winter of 1429 to 1430 was a period of uncertainty and frustration for Joan. Her voices continued to speak to her, but their messages were less clear and encouraging than they had been during the great campaigns of the previous summer. They warned her of dangers ahead and promised that she would face great trials before her mission was complete, but they no longer provided the specific, actionable guidance that had made her so effective as a military leader. During this period, Joan participated in several smaller military operations, including an unsuccessful siege of Loire. These campaigns lacked the divine blessing that had characterized her earlier victories, and they served mainly to reinforce the growing perception that her moment of special favor had passed. In December 1429, Charles granted Joan and her family patents of nobility, elevating them to the ranks of the aristocracy in recognition of her services to the crown. This honor was both a reward for past achievements and a suggestion that her active military career might be coming to an end. In medieval society, such patents were often granted to successful commanders as a form of honorable retirement, but Joan was not ready to retire. Despite the setbacks and disappointments of recent months, she remained convinced that her mission was not complete. Her voices continued to speak of work yet to be done, enemies yet to be defeated, and divine plans yet to be fulfilled. She rejected the comfortable life that her new noble status might have provided and prepared to return to the field of battle. The opportunity came in the spring of 1430, when the Burgundians launched a new offensive aimed at recapturing territories that had declared for Charles during the previous year's victorious campaigns. The city of Compiègne, which had been one of the first to join the French cause after the coronation at Reims, was now under siege by a combined Burgundian and English force. Joan's decision to relieve Compiègne would prove to be the most fateful of her brief career. Unlike her earlier campaigns, this one was undertaken without explicit royal authorization and with only a small force of volunteers. The king, committed to his diplomatic strategy, was reluctant to authorize major military operations that might complicate ongoing negotiations with Burgundy. But Joan could not stand by while French cities were reconquered by enemies who had seemed so thoroughly defeated just months earlier. Her voices, she claimed, were urging her to action, promising that divine assistance would again be provided to those who fought with righteous purpose. In April 1430, she set out for Compiègne with a small army of loyal followers, determined to prove that the spirit that had triumphed at Orleans and Reims was not yet extinguished. The relief of Compiègne would become Joan's last campaign, the final chapter in a military career that had transformed the course of the 100 Years' War. It would also become the beginning of a new and more terrible phase of her story, one that would lead not to victory and glory but to capture, trial, and ultimate martyrdom in the flames of Rouen.